During the Halloween season, I frequently revisit a lot of different survival horror games that I've generally really liked, or even delve into ones that I hadn't finished. But one title in particular that over the past handful of years that I've played through time and time again around this time of year is Resident Evil 7. And while I know that that game's been on the market for quite a while now, it's a game to me that is special in the Resident Evil series. And there's a lot of things that that game really did that I thought truly changed the landscape of Resident Evil and built upon some of the previous games in a really intelligent way. And in this video, I'm going to go over some of the great things about that title and why I believe that's one of the best Resident Evil releases in recent times. Let's take a look. Back when Resident Evil 4 came out, I was a massive fan. I played through that game multiple times. Actually, when I say multiple times, I've probably beat that game, if you count all the different platforms that it's been on, at least 20, maybe 25 times now. And it's a game that over the years I can revisit over and over again. But one of the downsides to that game was, well, it took a different approach to Resident Evil. It also pushed the series into somewhat of a weird direction when you consider the legacy of Resident Evil. And what I mean by that is we had Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, 0, Code Veronica that were all survival horror games with, in a lot of ways, very robotic mechanics that made surviving in some of the areas feel very hard. Whereas you get into Resident Evil 4 and it flips that on its head and it has very streamlined mechanics that now made the game a lot more action-oriented and action-packed in general. And instead of feeling helpless, you typically, in many cases, felt like a one-man army against hordes of zombified villagers. And that was a good thing at the time, and it made Resident Evil feel different and fresh, but it resulted in some really lackluster follow-ups. Now, I want to set the expectation. I was a fan of Resident Evil 5, but it felt like it took that action approach and amplified it even more, and as a result, you ended up having a game that no longer really felt like Resident Evil and felt more like an action game. And then following that, it seems like the creators kind of realized this was what was going on and tried to experiment with the god-awful Resident Evil 6, and you ended up with a series that, at that point in time, felt like it was at a standstill. I remember when 6 came out, I thought to myself, maybe this is the end of the Resident Evil franchise, or the end of what I appreciated about it, and something that I might not even choose to look back at this point. And that was really a shame, because growing up, Resident Evil, and you've probably seen many of my other videos, those are games that, for me, I'm very, very fond of. They have a very strong impact on my love of gaming and generally just my love of survival horror titles. And so when I saw how bad Resident Evil 6 was, it was really just such a shame. But then comes in Resident Evil 7. And what we ended up seeing is a whole change of the formula. And I'll be completely transparent. At first, I was not a fan of the switch to a first-person perspective, and I thought this might actually detract from what I enjoyed about Resident Evil, because for me, Resident Evil was a third-person or a fixed camera angle type game. And I thought that bringing it to that first-person mode kind of just made it seem more in line with other horror first-person shooters, and something about that didn't settle well with me. But fortunately, I was completely wrong. And one of the things that I really appreciated was Capcom took it as an opportunity to make the game feel just as cinematic. And they didn't just stop at adding cool set pieces, but they also framed it in a way through the camera, through the found camera horror genre, that's what I'm trying to get at, by making it feel like this was almost like someone glimpsing into something they shouldn't, like almost like a Blair Witch Project sort of experiment. And I thought that worked very well. It felt like it just made sense for what Capcom was trying to accomplish. And as far as the story goes interspersed with that, I thought that this all worked really well. And what I mean is you have a lot of very pronounced characters and villains like the Baker family, and even at some points your wife Mia, and those aspects to the game done through the first person camera, in my opinion, wouldn't have been accomplished the same way if they were doing it from a fixed camera angle or even having interspersed cutscenes. The way they had it set up where it was all done from that first person camera angle and having those characters like Jack and Marguerite Baker get in your face like they did, to me, was something that worked very well. And it felt very intimidating a lot of times. And even when you're going through corridors and you're encountering these enemies, it felt far scarier, in my opinion, than had we done it through a fixed camera angle or even a behind-the-shoulder third-person camera angle like some of the other Resident Evils had taken up doing. And so that switch to that first-person approach to me worked incredibly well, and it really added to the series. But what I think happened that was most special was Resident Evil 7, to me, felt more like a traditional Resident Evil than a lot of the more recent releases did. And what I mean was, came back where a lot of the exploratory elements of the areas you were in, with getting different keys and going to different areas and finding different puzzles and exploring different parts of the Baker estate. And to me, that was something that was missing from 4, 5, and 6 that I really missed. But the balance that Capcom found in that, by being able to give us this sort of traditional Resident Evil environment, was also still being able to intersperse enough interesting action moments without making this game feel like it was you as a one-man army against hordes of enemies. And part of that was done by balancing out the enemy types. You're not facing villagers who you can pinpoint, their legs, their arms, their head, and keep shooting at hordes and hordes of them and slowing them down. Instead, we ended up having the mold, which oftentimes felt a little more sluggish, but also very powerful. So you had to figure out how you were going to approach them, but it didn't ever make you feel too powerless, but it made you feel powerless enough when you were playing through the game, so it didn't end up turning into a one-man army action movie approach like some of the other Resident Evils, which to me was the beautiful balance that Capcom failed to have in some of the previous titles that were in the Resident Evil franchise, which to me was a fantastic thing. I liked the pacing that added to the game, and it also brought back a lot of the horror. And for me, one of the things that was majorly missing from Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 was, yeah, there were scary things that were going on, but it never actually felt scary. Whereas with Resident Evil 7, you had a mixture of enemies who felt very strong, enemies who came out of nowhere, enemies who, even like Jack Baker, could burst through walls. Those were things that were completely missing from some of the other Resident Evil titles. And being able to bring that back with a traditional feeling Resident Evil world, as well as not overdoing it with the action, felt, in my mind, almost perfect. And this kind of speaks to another greater element of the game, and that's how Capcom was able to tie these things into the story. And what I want to set the expectation on is, I'm not overly critical of the Resident Evil stories. A lot of them to me are a little ridiculous, but I thought the way Capcom handled what was going on in the Baker estate, framed through the storyline and the way they introduced the enemies and the different villains, worked so well. Well, I will say the last, 10% of the game, the story kind of faltered, but overall, it was almost necessary to tell the story that it did, to have the figureheads that it did. And what I mean is, the Eveline plot point where she basically corrupted everyone around her and turned them into these monsters was something that I thought worked incredibly well. And I thought having it in a rural part of America where these individuals are basically simple farmers essentially turned bad was a great approach. And I thought it resulted in having some of the most memorable and best Resident Evil villains in recent times. My opinion, Jack Baker turned into this superhuman monster was something that worked very well. Same with Marguerite, which resulted in some of the most disturbing encounters that I've faced in recent Resident Evil titles. I thought that they did a fantastic job of using that plot point to really bring everything together. And even beyond that, I actually enjoyed some of the, after revisiting Resident Evil 7 multiple times now, I even enjoyed the somewhat controversial crashed ship areas near the end of the game with the way that brought back some of the different elements and the way Capcom used some of the found footage to explain what happened prior to Evelyn ending up at the Baker estate. And for me, I thought that Resident Evil 7, the ability for Capcom to really capitalize on the first-person format, the way Capcom fleshed out a lot of its villains in this format, but also kept it feeling like a traditional Resident Evil, and the way Capcom was able to tie that together within the Resident Evil franchise through its story, I thought Resident Evil 7 was just ultimately one of the more special survival horror titles in recent times, but most importantly, probably the most special Resident Evil entry that we've seen in recent times. This isn't to detract against what's gone on with Village or even the Resident Evil 4 remake that we saw come out, but this is just to say that I appreciate that Capcom really looked at what was going on with that series and reinvented it by using some of the older mechanics but updating them for modern audiences in a very profound way. And as a result, I would argue that right now the Resident Evil series and franchise is one of the strongest due to this pivot that they changed in terms of their structure and approach to the series again. And something that I'm really looking forward to when we see a Resident Evil 9 or whatever else Capcom has in store for us.